right, my name is Robert Ake. This is the 15th of October 2021, and I'm relaying some information that I know about the Western Trail, which was one of the, not the most famous of all the trails. The Chisholm, I think, probably has that honor, but it was certainly one of the most important trails as the railroads moved west in Kansas to still allow cattle from Texas to go north to the slaughter pens. The Western Trail really starts well south of San Antonio, and it is an accumulation of what were called feeder trails that came from all the big ranches. And as the ranchers did the roundups and they counted the cattle and they did branding, they would sort of combine together with their trail parties and start to move the cattle up north. The first really big town that it goes through is Kerrville. Kerrville was a main junction of the Western Trail, and from Kerrville it headed north, essentially up through Ingram, and then to what was then Knoxville, which is where I live, that is now a ghost town with only a few inhabitants left living here. But at the time, the trail had to cross water because there were so many cattle that moved across it. And then let me just digress and say that the trail really only existed for less than 10 years. The innovations of rail and just different methods of moving cattle rendered it obsolete fairly quickly. But in that short period of time, 7 or 8 million head of cattle passed right by this house, headed north, as well as 1 million horses. We can't forget that horses were also integral to everything out west, and they were very valuable, so a lot of horses went north to be sold as well. The town of Knoxville really came about after the Civil War, when large numbers of Confederate veterans returned home looking for a homestead, and so many came into this area. My great-great-grandfather moved here in 1873 with his wife. His mother lived up at Fort McCavitt. She was married to a judge. The family moved here, and they started with 160 acres and eventually grew to 12,000 acres as their ranch grew over time. The town of Knoxville at one time had several dozen families living here. It had its own, it was the first rock schoolhouse built in the county, and is still in excellent shape and is used as a voting precinct. The cemetery here has the remains of Creed Taylor, who's a noted hero of the Texas Republic, also fought in the Civil War as a private in, I believe, Captain Hayes' company, and was a noted courier and Indian fighter. And he built a home which is west of here, just past the James River, which supposedly was one of the finest houses between San Antonio and El Paso. I've seen photos of it, and it was quite majestic. The town did not survive the middle of the 20th century. With the advent of rural farming districts and mail being delivered, there was no need for a post office, and hence the town was dissolved. So all that really remains is a store that also served as a post office, and the schoolhouse and the cemetery. My house was built in 1870. This was originally the first settlement of a white man in Kimball County. It was in 1859 by a gentleman named Judge Larimore, and he lived in a dugout here. He later sold to or gave the property to Leif McDonald, who was a nephew of the McDonalds that were massacred in Harper, but that's a different story. When the herders would bring the cattle through, they would always have an advance team that would come up to make sure that there was nothing obstructing the trail, and it actually went quite close to the schoolhouse. And the school at any given time had upwards of 24 children in it, and of course, as children can make a lot of racket, and they'd be very interested in watching the cattle go by. The teacher would often, if she couldn't get them quiet, she'd move them down the river, and they would have outdoor class under a tree farther down the river, just to keep from alarming the cattle, because there was always a danger of stampede. As I said, the cattle traversed rivers all the way north because they had to keep the cattle watered. And they would stop in the Little Devil's River and move through. The cattle would not move as an entire entity. They were broken into smaller groups that had their own drag team and their own lead and outrider. So they would not all arrive at the river at the same time. It was a very orchestrated event to move cattle in those days. It wasn't something you just did without any planning. The river is quite interesting. Over the years, it was used not only to take care of the needs of the people of Knoxville. At one time, a traveling circus came through, and the elephants were watered down in the Little Devil's River, along with all the zebras and the camels. So it's kind of interesting. The name of the river was originally Rock Creek on the earliest maps made by the 4th Cavalry out of Fort Concho. And then sometime after the Civil War, the name Little Devil's River came about. There is a Devil's River farther west in West Texas, so oftentimes I think the two names get confused. By the time let me begin by saying this. The name of the trail is officially the Western Trail. It's not the Great Western Trail, but you'll see that on many signs and posters because it makes it sound majestic. It was just called the Western Trail, and that's how the cowboys knew it to be called. My home was built in 1870. It's a 2-story rock structure. The walls are 2 feet thick. It had stout wooden shutters. The original house was 1 room. It had a fireplace at the end of it and 4 windows, 2 on the north side and 2 on the south side. In the years before and after the Civil War, there were significant Indian encroachments in this area. The Indians had originally been pushed back before the Civil War, but with the departure of most of the men to go fight east for the South, the Indians perceived a weakness in all of the frontier homes. And in fact, the frontier actually moved back about 100 miles during the Civil War. So, for instance, Mr. New, who replaced Mr. Knox as the Justice of the Peace, he originally lived up on the Llano River, but because of Indian depredations, he moved his family here. So they actually came east to get away from the threat of the Indians. The idea of fording up was a notion that I think originated back east during pre-revolutionary times when Indians would attack settlements, and all the local folks would come together and take refuge in a stockade or a fortified farmhouse. The same idea occurred here. At any given time, up to 12 families would come here with their women and children when the alarm was raised. And in fact, there's a story of Creed Taylor. He spotted upwards of 12 Indians on a ridge not far from here. And being the Indian fighter that he was, he came and raised the alarm. told my great-great-grandfather, who had also seen the Indians, and they went around warning all the locals to come here to seek refuge. From time to time, there was fighting in this area. There was really only one really recorded instance that I have absolute concrete facts on, and that was a fight between Texas Rangers and about a dozen Indians here on the Little Devils River, which actually ended better for the Indians than the Texas Rangers. But it was not uncommon for those kind of fights to take place. Generally, though, the Indians were only interested in stealing horses, looting, and things of that nature, but they would kill if provoked. And generally, the people that were most likely attacked were herders that were out by themselves with their herds and had no protection. The house has a cellar with gun ports. As I said, the walls are 2 feet thick, so you could hold off a sizable force here with just a few resolute men and women and children, and have no trouble doing that.